Season 1, Episode 1, Part 1, The House of Wisdom. In the beginning, how Islam understood the start of everything, before the first battle, before the first caliph, before the Prophet himself walked the earth, there was a question that no civilization could escape. Where did all of this come from? And if you are new here, this channel has been building something. Every episode connects. Hit subscribe so you are here for the next one. This history is only getting bigger from here. His name was Abu Ja'far Muhammad ibn Jarir Al-Tabari. He was born in the winter of 839 CE in a provincial city on the southern shore of the Caspian Sea, a place called Amul, in the highlands of Tabaristan. He memorized the Quran by the age of 7. He led prayer by 8. By 9, he was writing down the traditions of the Prophet. And by the time he died in Baghdad in 923 CE, he had produced what scholars across 14 centuries have called the single most important work of universal history ever written in the Islamic world. A work so vast, so comprehensive, so relentlessly sourced, that his students once asked him how long it would take to read the full draft. When he told them it would run to 30,000 folios, they said they could not read that in a lifetime. So he cut it. What remains is 5,000 pages of continuous history, from the moment God said be, to the year 915 CE. Every caliph, every battle, every succession crisis, every prophet. That work is called Ta'arikh al-Rusul wal-Muluk, the history of prophets and kings. And this channel is going to walk through it, episode by episode, from the very first word. This episode begins where Tabari begins. Not with a man, not with a battle, not even with the earth itself, but with time. With the question of what time even is. With a scholar in 9th century Baghdad who looked at everything that had ever happened and asked, before I can tell you the story of any of it, I need to tell you what story means. I need to tell you what before and after mean. I need to tell you what time is. That is where we start. Because Tabari was not just a historian. He was a jurist, a Quranic commentator, a theologian, and a man who had spent 50 years in Baghdad thinking harder about the nature of existence than most human beings ever will. When he sat down to write the history of the world, he did not begin with Adam. He began with the philosophy of time itself, because he understood something that most historians miss. You cannot tell the story of what happened without first understanding the medium in which it happened. So, what is time? Tabari gives us his answer in the opening pages of the history, and it is precise in the way that only a legal scholar trained in the exact meaning of words can be precise. Time, he says, is nothing more and nothing less than the hours of night and day. The word the Arabs use, Zaman, designates a period. The word Waqt designates a moment within that period. But both depend on the same thing, the movement of the sun and the moon through the sphere of the heavens. There is no time without that movement. There is no night and no day without the sun and the moon running their appointed circuits. And therefore, and here is where the argument gets interesting, before God created the sun and the moon, there was no time as human beings experience it. Think about what that means. It means that the 6 days in which God created the heavens and the earth were not days in any sense that we would recognize. Tabari transmits a tradition on the authority of Ibn Abbas, the cousin of the Prophet, and the greatest early authority on Quranic interpretation, that each of those 6 days of creation corresponds to 1,000 years of human reckoning. Other scholars put the figure at the same number. And Tabari, who never simply reports a tradition without evaluating it against the weight of all the others he has collected, concludes that this understanding is not contradicted by anything in the revelation, and is, in fact, the most defensible reading of what the sources preserve. 6 days, 6,000 years of human time. And before any of it, silence, not darkness, because darkness is itself a created thing. Not emptiness, because emptiness is a relation between things that exist. Before creation, there was only God, and Tabari wants his reader to feel the weight of that before moving one single step forward. He pauses here in a way that most historians would not. He stops the narrative and argues for the existence and uniqueness of God from first principles, not as a theologian performing a ritual, but as a man who genuinely believes that you cannot understand the history of the world unless you first understand that the world has a maker who is outside it, prior to it, and categorically unlike anything within it. His argument is elegant. Everything we can observe is either a body, or something that exists within a body. Everybody is either joined to something or separate from it. And everything that can be joined or separated is therefore dependent. It had a state before the joining, a state after, and something that caused the change. Whatever caused the change cannot itself be changeable in the same way, or the regress never ends. Therefore, there must be something that is not subject to composition or separation, not subject to change, not subject to time, and that something is the creator. He is not being abstract for the sake of abstraction. He is doing what any serious military commander does before a campaign, establishing the terrain. You need to know the ground before you can understand the movements. The ground here is existence itself. And then, with the philosophical terrain mapped, he turns to the question of what God created first. The traditions he collects disagree. Some say the first created thing was light and darkness. The great historian Ibn Ishaq, whose life of the Prophet forms the backbone of so much early Islamic historical writing, held that God created light and darkness before anything else, and then distinguished between them, making darkness the night and light the day. But Tabari evaluates this tradition and finds a stronger one, a report that traces back through multiple chains of transmission to the Prophet Muhammad himself, who said, and Tabari cites this with the confidence of a man who has weighed against everything he knows, that the first thing God created was the pen. Not light, not the throne, not the heavens, the pen. God said to it, write. And the pen asked, what shall I write, my Lord? And God said, write what is predestined. And from that hour, the pen proceeded to record everything that would ever be, every life, every death, every decision, every consequence, to the coming of the hour. Tabari takes this tradition seriously, in a way that a casual reader might miss. He is not simply relaying a cosmological myth. He is making a statement about the nature of history itself. The pen is the instrument of divine foreknowledge, made material. It is the moment at which the will of God became, in some sense, recorded. Not because God needed a record, but because the act of inscription is the act that makes history possible. You cannot have a story without a record. You cannot have meaning without sequence. The pen precedes the world, because the pen is what makes the world narratable. This is the kind of insight that separates Tabari from every other historian of his era. He is not just compiling reports. He is thinking at every step about what history is, and why it matters that we tell it. After the pen came the clouds, fine clouds that preceded even the throne of God. And then the throne itself, created and placed upon the water. And then, in 6 immense cosmic days, the heavens and the earth, the mountains, the rivers, the trees, the sun and the moon, set into their orbits, and finally, before sunset on the 6th day, at the end of the last hour of creation, the first human being. But before that human being, before Adam, there was a rebellion. And that rebellion is the reason everything that follows is complicated. His name, before it was taken from him, was Al-Harith. He was an angel, but not an ordinary angel. Tabari collects a remarkable convergence of traditions on this point, drawing on Ibn Abbas and multiple chains of transmission, and they all say the same thing. This angel was the most honored, the most capable, the most trusted being in the lower heavens. He was made ruler over the space between the heaven and the earth. He was a keeper of paradise. He was, in the traditions that Tabari finds most credible, a member of a tribe of angels called the jinn, beings created not from light, as most angels were, but from fire. And he was extraordinary, so extraordinary that his extraordinary nature became his undoing. The traditions that Tabari assembles trace the corruption of this angel to one of two sources, and both, in their way, tell the same story. Either he became pleased with himself because of the immensity of his worship, his knowledge, and his authority, and that pleasure curdled into pride. Or he was sent by God to subdue a race of corruptive jinn who had filled the earth with bloodshed, and his success in that mission went to his head. I have done something no one else has done. And God, who knew what was stirring inside him even while the other angels did not, prepared the tests that would bring it to the surface. Both versions point to the same spiritual catastrophe, a being who was given everything, who served faithfully, who stood at the apex of created hierarchy, and who, in the privacy of his own soul, began to believe that his excellence was his, not given, not borrowed. His. Tabari does not moralize about this in the voice of a preacher. He reports it with the precision of a diagnostician. The disease is pride. The symptom is the belief that you deserve what you have been given. The crisis comes when God, aware of what is building inside this angel, announces to all the angels, I am placing on earth a vicegerent. The angels, not yet knowing about the pride that had been germinating in Al-Harith, asked the question that any loyal advisor would ask. Will you place on earth one who will cause corruption and shed blood, while we praise and sanctify you? They were not challenging God. They were asking, with genuine confusion, why the pattern of destruction they had already seen among the jinn on earth was going to be repeated. They thought they were the obvious candidates for vicegerency. They thought they understood the calculation. God said, I know what you do not know. What they did not know was that the vicegerent God was preparing would be the instrument by which the hidden sickness in Al-Harith would finally be revealed, and the instrument by which it would be answered. What they did not know was Adam. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to know what you make of Tabari's decision to open a history of the world, not with a battle or a dynasty, but with a philosophy of time. Why does a historian begin there? What does it tell you about what he thought history was for? Drop your answer below. I read everyone. And if you are not yet subscribed, this is the moment. What happens next is the reason this channel exists. Hit subscribe so you do not miss it. But before we get to Adam, before we get to the clay and the pen and the moment the spirit entered a body that had been lying inanimate for 40 years, we need to understand what Tabari is doing with the disagreements he is collecting. Because Tabari does something that no simple storyteller would do. He does not give you one tradition and move on. He gives you 10. He gives you the tradition of Ibn Abbas, and the tradition of Ibn Ishaq, and the tradition of Karb al-Ahbar, and the tradition of Wahb ibn Munabbi, and then he evaluates them. He tells you which chain of transmission is stronger. He tells you which report is contradicted by another, and why he finds one more persuasive. He is not writing folklore. He is practicing something that looks, across the distance of 11 centuries, remarkably like what we would today call critical historiography. Consider the question of how many years the world will last in total. Tabari collects traditions that say 7,000 years. He collects traditions that say 6,000. He collects Jewish chronologies, Christian chronologies, Zoroastrian chronologies, all of them disagreeing, all of them working from their own sources and their own calculations. And he does not throw up his hands. He weighs them. He applies the principle that a tradition traceable to the Prophet Muhammad carries more weight than a tradition traceable to a scholar. Not because scholars are worthless, but because the Prophet has a different epistemic status. And he arrives at a conclusion. The world's total span, from the first act of creation to the final annihilation of everything except the face of God, is 14,000 years of human reckoning. 7. From the creation of the pen to the creation of Adam. 7. From Adam to the hour. He acknowledges that the Jewish calculation puts the years from Adam's fall to the time of the Prophet's migration at 4,642 years. He acknowledges that the Christian calculation puts it at 5,992. He acknowledges that the Zoroastrians count only 3,139 years from their ancestral king Geomart, whom some identify with Adam and others do not, to the same point. He does not dismiss any of these. He notes them. He measures them against what the Prophet's traditions preserve. And he continues. This is the historic war lens, and here is why it matters. Tabari is writing in 9th century Baghdad, the intellectual capital of the medieval world, at a moment when Islam has been in direct contact with Jewish scholars, Christian theologians, and Persian learned men for 2 centuries. The question of how old the world is and how its history should be organized was not an academic puzzle. It was a civilizational argument. If the Jews are right about the chronology, it has implications for the prophecies they hold about the future. If the Christians are right, it has different implications. If the Zoroastrians are right, it situates human civilization in a completely different arc. Tabari is not just writing history. He is writing the Islamic answer to the question of how all history fits together. And he is doing it with enough rigor that the answer can stand against cross-examination from 3 other great civilizations simultaneously. That is what makes him not just a historian, but a strategic thinker of the first order. He understood that the narrative of origins is always a narrative of authority. Whoever controls the story of the beginning controls the meaning of everything that follows. And so he begins, methodically, comprehensively, with the pen, with the throne upon the water, with the 6 great days, with the sun placed in its orbit, and the moon in its appointed phases, with night preceding day, because before the sun was created, there was darkness, and light came after, and with one angel, at the apex of the created order, looking at the announcement of a human vicegerent and feeling, somewhere in the fire from which he was made, something that had no name yet but would soon have a very famous one. The angel who was called Al-Harith would not survive this episode with that name. When God commands and a created being refuses, when excellence becomes the foundation of arrogance rather than gratitude, the tradition Tabari preserves tells us what happens to that excellence. It is taken. The name is lost. What remains is not a ruler, not a keeper of paradise, not the most honored being in the lower heavens. What remains is something that will spend the rest of human history trying to make us as miserable as it is. Iblis, the bedeviled one, the one from whom hope of good was eliminated, in the root meaning of the word. He did not become evil in a moment of passion. He became evil in a moment of logic. The logic of a being who looked at God's command and calculated that his own nature was superior to the thing God was commanding him to honor. He was not impulsive. He was proud. And pride, Tabari's sources suggest, is the most dangerous spiritual error precisely because it wears the costume of merit. We are not yet at the moment of the command. We are not yet at the clay figure lying inanimate on the ground for 40 years, while Iblis walks around it, kicks it with his foot, hears the hollow sound it makes, and says, "This is not something for making sounds. What was it created for? If I am given authority over it, I will ruin it. And if it is given authority over me, I will disobey it." That moment is next. The clay, the command, the prostration that every being in the created order makes, and the one that does not. That is part 2, and it is going to change the shape of everything. The next episode will take us directly into the construction of Adam, the clay, the spirit, the moment of animation, and the rebellion that answered the moment of creation. If you missed the philosophical foundation we built today, this episode, go back and watch it now. It is linked on your screen and in the description. You will not understand what Iblis refuses to do unless you understand what he was and what he was being asked to accept. If you have not subscribed yet, do it now. The algorithm will not show you the next episode unless you tell it to. And if this episode gave you something, if Tabari's way of thinking about time and history landed the way it should, share it. One share from you puts this history in front of someone who has never heard it told this way. This is the House of Wisdom, where history is never just the past,